Welcome back to my channel. My name is Kayla and I like to talk about books, reading vlogs, lots of stuff like that. If any of that interests you, then definitely please subscribe. But today I'm going to be talking about the book Fire and Blood by George R.R. Martin. I feel like this has been kind of a long time coming for me because I have read all of the A Song of Ice and Fire. I read them a while ago, and I did read The Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, and I really liked them. I don't know why I put this off. Honestly, I kind of thought that this would be a lot drier than it is, but boy was I wrong, and I'll get into that a little bit later. I'm going to start off by kind of giving a summary synopsis to the best of my ability because a lot happens in volume 1. It's like a full fictional history, so I'm just gonna kind of go through the main points, I guess, and then I'm gonna talk a little bit about my thoughts. But basically, Fire and Blood follows the Targaryen rule of Westeros, starting with Aegon the Conqueror, also known as Aegon the Dragon, and his two sister wives, Rhaenys and Visenya. It actually then follows all of the successive Targaryen rulers that follow after him and the fictional history of their ruling up through Aegon III, and I'll get into who he is in a little bit. Aegon III's reign ends a little over 150 years after Aegon conquers Westeros. So this history starts off, I believe, about 300 years before the events in A Song of Ice and Fire / Game of Thrones, and then it ends about 150 years ago or 150 years after the conquer by Aegon. So just to give you an idea of the timeline if you haven't read it, but if you haven't read it and you do want to, I will be talking about it pretty openly. Like, there's just gonna be tons of spoilers in this video. If you're watching House of the Dragon and you don't want that to be spoiled, you might want to not watch this. This story, the real story, begins with Aegon the Conqueror, also known as Aegon the Dragon, like I said, and his older sister Visenya and his younger sister Rhaenys, and they were both also his wives. So very true to Targaryen custom would be marrying like brother to sister, nephew to niece, cousin to cousin. That's really common, and you just have to get used to it when you're reading this. It's a hard thing to get used to. You definitely will randomly just be thinking, oh, how cute, and then you'll remember that they're siblings and you'll be like, ick, you know? But anyway, he was a little bit unusual in the fact that he did still take two wives. So not only were they both his sisters, but he also had two wives, and that is not really a Targaryen thing. That was kind of like his own deal. Anyway, after Aegon, the book moves on to the rule of Aenys, son of Aegon and Rhaenys, as well as the rule of Aegon's other son, Maegor, with his sister Visenya. So that's like his older sister. Maegor had a very tumultuous reign, and it was really terrible. It was actually pretty short-lived just because of how awful it was and everything that ensued from it. But his name, he was known as Maegor the Cruel, not what you want to be known as. But after that, the throne was actually passed down to Jaehaerys, who was Aenys's son and is honestly my personal favorite throughout this history, throughout these rulers. He was super fair, super competent, and was actually known as the Conciliator, which gives you a pretty good idea of how he was ruling. He was also, I think, known as the Old King. He ruled for a really long time. Yeah, just really cool. He was married to Alysanne, and it seems really sweet, but again, then you kind of remember, you're like, oh, that's right, they're siblings. But his wife Alysanne was super sweet and actually also was fun to read about because she was really involved in like the well-being of the realm and in Westeros, specifically the well-being of women and people who were in positions of like less power. She would travel with Jaehaerys all over. They really gave off the same vibe that Aegon gave off, which was like competent, but very much wanting to unite the realm, wanting to get things done, and I really liked that vibe. So Alysanne would travel with Jaehaerys all the time. They would ride their dragons and visit everybody, like everywhere, big and small, and she would always go with them, and she would hold these things called women's councils, and these were just a time where she would hear all of the grievances of women, not just highborn women though, like lowborn women too. Yeah, Alysanne actually even ended up going to the Wall without Jaehaerys and visiting at Winterfell without him as well. And while she was at the Wall, she even held one of her women's councils in Molestown, which is pretty cool. If you know from like the core books, Molestown is not exactly a place you would think a queen would go and want to listen to the grievances of all these lowborn women, but she did, because they were, just like I said, very like good rulers. They were a good team, and like it seemed like Jaehaerys treated Alysanne really well, and they were my favorite to read about. Anyway, so after his long and measured rule, the throne was then passed down to his grandson Viserys, and part of that is because during like all of the conflict with Maegor, a lot of their children it just wasn't a great outcome. But anyway, this is actually kind of where the HBO show House of the Dragon picks up the story. And honestly, I completely understand why, because it gives a lot of like exciting material to work with. There's basically like a lot of war, a lot of conflict, inter-Targaryen conflict. It's very interesting. This part of the Targaryen history is known as the Dance of Dragons, as there was, like I said, a massive war fought over the throne, and almost all of the Targaryen dragons perished in this war, as well as significant portions of the bloodlines. It's really just probably the juiciest part of the history. Like, there's just the most happening. The other thing you would maybe want to cover would be like Maegor, but that's just like depressing stuff. This is more like, it's sad, but it's also very interesting. There's a lot of action. So Viserys is king and only produces one living child who reaches maturity with his first wife. I don't remember her name, but this child is his daughter Rhaenyra, and he officially names her his successor with everything, the whole pomp and circumstance, a bunch of the lords all swearing their fealty to her, and everybody, like, she's officially named as his heir. It's not presumed. It's something that he like puts down in writing. Like, it's a thing. So after his wife dies in childbirth, when she's expecting her next child, he actually remarries and produces several sons with a woman named Alicent Hightower, who is actually the daughter of his hand. And the eldest of these sons is Aegon II, though he actually maintains, even after these kids are born, that Rhaenyra is still his heir. He doesn't change anything. Rhaenyra is still considered his heir. Of course, this does go against the Westeros custom of succession passing through the male line, which many believe that by law, even though he named Rhaenyra his heir, Aegon II was still his heir. Like, a lot of people believe that that was just his legal heir, because that's how succession always worked in Westeros. So when Viserys finally passes, there is a massive dispute, and Alicent and her father do a bunch of shady stuff to make sure Aegon gets crowned, and like right away, and it's ultimately a really big war that erupts between the two of them, between Aegon II and Rhaenyra, over who is going to sit the throne. Oh my gosh, and Aegon's younger brother, the one-eye guy. Can we talk about the fact that in the book, he shows up and rolls up with a sapphire in his eye? Why was that cut out of the show? I'm telling you, they better include that in the show at some point, because if they would cut out the fact that he would put a sapphire where his eye patch goes, where his eye used to be. I'm not the biggest fan of the guy, but that is baller. Like, I don't know how else to say it. That's just the coolest thing. If you lose your eye and then are like, I'll just stick a giant sapphire there. Like I said, there's a lot of fascinating details. I won't get into all of them. Maybe I will later, but the succession actually ultimately ends up passing to Rhaenyra's son, Aegon III, and that is her son with her uncle Daeron, who's her second husband. This is the last of the history covered in the volume, is the rule of Aegon III, Rhaenyra's son. It's really interesting though, because like I said, during the Dance of the Dragons, it was destructive to to the bloodline, and almost all the dragons died as well. It's an interesting part for this volume to stop because I think it marks a little bit the end of one era of Targaryen rule, and then the next is kind of where it like fizzles out. So it seems like this is the really like great, interesting Targaryen rule where they still had dragons, but Aegon the Third was actually the last Targaryen ruler where dragons were alive, and the last of the Targaryen dragons died during Aegon the Third's rule. So it'll be really, really, really interesting to see volume 2 and see what it's like covering the Targaryen rule without dragons. It feels like it's gonna be a pretty different tone. I think obviously dragons were essential to a lot of just the motto of like Fire and Blood, House of the Dragon. It's just a very like essential component to, I feel like, their heritage and how they identify as rulers. So it'll be really interesting. My dog fell asleep and she's dreaming. She was doing a little so I guess for this part, I'm just gonna kind of go over some of my thoughts, my like review of this as a book. Probably my number one takeaway just from what I thought this would be is I thought this would be a little bit more of like a dry, boring read. Following the Targaryens, I thought it might be kind of confusing to follow with the names and stuff. I just thought it might be more tedious to get through than it actually was. To be honest, it was not tedious at all. Super easy to keep everybody straight. There's even like a family tree with a bloodline in the back. So it's like really easy to keep everybody straight. Yes, a lot of the names are repeated, but they're always repeated in such a different context that I feel like you're never confused. So that's the number one takeaway I had with this, was that I was super pleasantly surprised that it was not dry or confusing at all. It was very easy for me to understand who was who and what was going on for the most part. I think I already mentioned this, but my next big thought is just that as far as like my favorite characters kind of go, I really loved Jaehaerys and his wife Alysanne. They were just like fun to read about. I understand why they will never be like interesting or popular. Like they're not gonna get an HBO show because Jaehaerys was just chilling while he was ruling, you know? Like, he was the conciliator. Nobody's gonna give him an HBO show. Nobody's gonna talk about what a nice, fair, and level-headed ruler he was. That's not gonna be interesting to watch. So I understand why they picked the era of history that they picked, but those are my favorite characters. I'm really, really excited, like I said, for volume 2 though, to see how the history unfolds and how the Targaryen relationship as rulers, like to Westeros, how that changes when they no longer have dragons. But I think that one of the biggest things that made this really, really such a pleasant read as a fictional history is the blend of like, there's a really rich detail to it, but it's not too much. There's only detail when you really need there to be detail, if that makes sense. Like, it's not extraneous, there's not too much of it, because sometimes I feel like George R. R. Martin does give almost like too much description, if that makes sense. But this was perfect because to make it seem more realistic as a fictional history, there are like gaps, or there are even times where the accounts of certain events differ a little bit according to like who's recounting them, who's recalling them. So I really like that because I feel like it adds to, and like obviously it's not a real history, but I feel like it adds to the authenticity of the story, and it also adds this really nice interpretive element where you can kind of interpret it as the saucier version, interpret it as the tamer version. I don't know, I just really like that element because I feel like that's how real history is. It's told differently depending on whose viewpoint it is. It's told differently depending on the lens it's viewed through, and we consume it differently depending on the lens that we're reading it through. So I really enjoyed that. I feel like he did a great job of covering that. I love like the little footnotes and everything. The illustrations were so cool as well. Yeah, I just really enjoyed those. I really enjoyed, like I said, those components that made it feel like real history and like hundreds of years of changed context versus like people might have been more or less popular when they were in power, and we interpret that differently based on how the world is now. So I really like that he was able to capture that nuance. Does that make sense? I don't know. I feel like I'm just mumbling and rambling on about this, but I was so into it. It adds a lot of the richness of like the history and the world, and there's definitely a lot more interesting references, obviously too, to like old Valyria and all of that kind of stuff. It's just interesting. And House Valerian, which I feel like isn't even talked about in A Song of Ice and Fire. I'm not really sure how much more I have to say about it, but I will just make like a little bit of a comment on my thoughts on House of the Dragon, kind of compared to the book so far. I think that they definitely chose the correct like era of Targaryen history to adapt. Something that makes me super, super hopeful was that I did not realize how little of this era of history that they were covering with the whole Dance of the Dragons. It is a very prolonged chunk of the book. There's a lot of detail and story there. There's a ton of action there. So I'm very like optimistic that they will do a good job with adapting this show, because the material is all there. All of the material that they need is already there, and all they have to do is like write some of the extra dialogue, all of the rest of the source material that they need to finish out this story. I could imagine that they could probably do it in 4 seasons of the show. I think that that would be reasonable, 4, maybe 5 seasons, especially with the way that they're going and the pacing that they're going. It feels exactly how it should. This story is just brutal. I mean, people are just dying left and right. This is gonna be fun to see people who haven't read the book, like as the show unfolds. It's gonna be really, really, really fun. If we thought that they got rid of characters quickly on Game of Thrones, it is like next level in Dance of the Dragons. It's just like bam, 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 everybody. So I feel like this is gonna be very, very interesting to watch unfold. I'm so excited to see the reactions of people who have not read Fire and Blood. And yeah, just in general, also very excited to watch the rest of the show. I don't know that I have a ton more to say about this other than like 5 out of 5. Honestly, one of my favorite books of the year that I read. Just really fantastic. Yeah, but let me know what your thoughts are in the comments. Please, actually, I truly want to discuss this below. Nobody in my life has read this book. Nobody that I know is planning to read it. I have nobody to talk about this with, and I really can't talk about it with people because it's spoilers for House of the Dragon for people who haven't read it. So I really can't talk about it with anybody that I know. So yeah, tell me what your thoughts are. That's gonna be it for this video. Like, subscribe, all that good stuff, and I will see you later.